Hello, I'm Chris Tyrrell, Research Curator of Botany here at the Milwaukee Public Museum. I also care for the botany collections, and since sharing is caring, I'd like to share with you some selected components of the presentation I gave as a part of MPM's Lunch and Lecture series.
Did you know?
Aside from water and milk products, every single thing we drink is derived from plants. In this talk, I will specifically address tonic water, root beer, chocolate, tea, wine, and liquor, as well as some tidbits of science on everyone's favorite stimulant, caffeine! You can watch the entire talk from beginning to end, or use the descriptions below to jump to whichever section you are most interested in. Don't worry, you won't hurt my feelings. Much. Please enjoy the Botany of Beverages, but be sure to enjoy responsibly. Cheers! Okay, tonic water. Now, I forgot to obscure the name of the company here. I'm not trying to advocate anything. But tonic water is, the compound in tonic water is called quinine. And quinine is it's a compound made by a tree. And this compound is actually an anti-malarial or a malaria prevention medicine. So that's where the word tonic comes from. That's what the medicinal association is. And malaria was a big deal when Europeans started colonizing the tropics. There was a lot of infections of malaria. And so you would drink tonic water to kind of keep yourself as a defense away from acquiring malaria. Now what's interesting, quinine, it's got this Q on it. And if any of you have ever worked at a bar or looked at the gun on a bar, whatever they call those, the bar gun? Yeah, the soda gun, thank you. The soda gun has the letter Q on it, and that Q is for tonic water because the Q is associated with the quinine, right? So you press the Q, and that's the shot for tonic water. So that was kind of an interesting fact there. Now, does anybody know how you can tell a good tonic water? Can you tell the quinine content? It's color, yes, but very more specifically, it's color under a black light. So I'm gonna turn the black light on here. All right. So quinine has this property of fluorescing under long wave radiation. All right. So if you put a UVA lamp onto a bottle of tonic water, if it doesn't fluoresce like this, it doesn't actually have quinine in it. It's just got some other flavorant in it. So something to keep in mind. Now, I mentioned that quinine comes from a tree, right? And the tree that it comes from is the cinchona tree. And now, cinchonas are native to South America. In fact, they're, Peru and Bolivia. And the cinchona is the national tree of Peru. At one time, cinchonas, the quinine in the bark of the cinchonas was so highly sought after that these trees were at risk of over-harvesting. Luckily now, since we have not artificial, but we have other malarial medications. These trees have been making a comeback because we no longer need to harvest the trees in order to destroy them. So, cinchona tree. And one thing, what's really cool here, take a look. This is the flower off the cinchona tree. It's this long tubular flower right here. And this, having these long tubular flowers that are either pink or red, this is called a flowering syndrome. And this flowering syndrome tells me that the cinchonas are pollinated either by birds, like hummingbirds, or butterflies, because butterflies have these long proboscises, these long tongues that can get down into the back of the tubular flower. Contrast that with bee-pollinated plants that won't have this tube on there. And one more thing about the cinchona tree is it's in the same family as coffee. So species are related by families, right? And so the cinchona is in the coffee family. Okay, root beer. So the root or whatever, I'm a Wisconsinite, so I say root beer. Root beer, there actually are roots or were roots in root beer. And the root is from the sassafras tree. So sassafras albidum, the white sassafras, that tree, it's native to North America, everywhere from Maine all the way over to Wisconsin. We have one specimen from Kenosha County, in fact, of sassafras in Wisconsin. And it stretches down south to probably the Appalachians. I'm not exactly sure how far south sassafras goes. But the roots of sassafras would be dug up and boiled with a bunch of different other flavorants, and that would produce your root beer. Interestingly, there is no set recipe for root beer. So if someone tells you, I have the root beer recipe, they're lying, because everybody had their own set of root beer recipes, and the only thing that really united them was having this tree in there. And now I say that, but you have to take it with a grain of salt, because this doesn't even hold true, especially not anymore. So one thing, the reason why sassafras was in root beer is sassafras contains a chemical in it, and that chemical would mask a medicine taste, right? So if you're back in the frontiers of Wisconsin in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, and the physician comes along and wants to treat your ailment with a solution of powdered mercury or something that's absolutely disgusting that your body wants to reject because, for good reason, he would boil sassafras root to cover up that medicinal taste so that you could get it down, right, to heal you. So that was sort of the origin of root beer. Root beer started to take off during the Prohibition era because that same property of covering up a medicinal taste would cover up the taste of really bad alcohol. So during Prohibition, there were no regulations. Everybody was doing their own homebrewed moonshine, and sometimes it wouldn't be that great, so you'd put saffrol in it, which is what comes from sassafras, and it would cover that up. Now, I mentioned that the sassafras wasn't the only plant that was inside of root beer. There's an alternative plant, sarsaparilla, and sarsaparilla is a vine that's from Central America. It was probably traded up into northern North America through native trade. Kind of looks like this down here. And sarsaparilla has this component, saponin. Saponin also masks the medicinal taste. So these two, sarsaparilla, sassafras, both had a chemical that masked medicinal taste. In the case of sassafras, there may actually be some medical background to it. It may be an anti-inflammatory, but it's also, there's some evidence that it's a carcinogen. So really, any of the root beer you get nowadays, it contains an artificial sassafras flavor. It doesn't actually have sassafras in it. At least I don't think so. Or it's in a very low quantity. What else do I have to say? I guess that's all I have to say about that. So, one more thing. I mentioned that we have one specimen of sassafras in the herbarium, which is, the museum's plant collection, from Wisconsin. But you won't find sassafras trees in Wisconsin anymore. And the reason for that was they were over-harvested and extirpated from the state. So extirpated means it's no longer growing here. The wood of this tree was really good for making barrels. So they got over-harvested for making barrels and furniture. The oils of the plant could also be used to make perfume. Is that a nice smell, sort of that root beer smell perfume? Interestingly enough, the leaves off the sassafras tree are used as a thickening agent. So if you pluck the leaves and drop them into a stew, the kind of like you use a bay leaf, the leaf would exude some kind of chemical that would thicken the stew, sort of like cornstarch. And sassafras leaves are actually still an ingredient in gumbos, key ingredient. So they were over-harvested in Wisconsin. Sadly, we no longer have them. So here's chocolate. So for those of you who've ever been to the rainforest exhibit here, we've got some great examples of chocolate. There's actually a model of a chocolate tree that's growing. If you haven't been there, you can look at it on the slide. So chocolate it grows in these pods like this. It comes from a tree. It's a rainforest tree that was native to Central America. It was native to Central America all the way to northern South America. So basically Mexico down to about Colombia, Venezuela, that area. And the tree, these pods, they're so heavy that they grow off of the trunk of the tree, right? So these pods, they're about this big. And inside of the pod, if you look, here's one cracked open. You've got these little kind of white nibs or niblets or something like that. I don't know what you want to call them. And this white stuff, this is kind of a gelatinous casing that's very sweet. People oftentimes eat this fresh. But underneath the white stuff are these little purple nodules, and that's where our cocoa comes from. So cocoa is, you dry out these seeds, basically, of the chocolate pod and crush it up, and you can press it to remove the fats, and then you get the cocoa powder. So chocolate, Theobroma cacao. Does anybody know what Theobroma stands for? This is the scientific name. Food of the gods, right. So Theo, that's God, and then broma, I guess, means food of. And the cacao here, that's actually a native word from the natives who were in Central America, the Nahuatl language. The cacao comes from, I got to remember what the word is, it's chocolatl. And chocolatl meant bitter water. So what they would do is they would do the same process of crushing up these seeds to get that cocoa and mixing it with water to make a drink. And the reason they made that drink is because it was a stimulant. So the stimulation comes from the fact that Theobroma is one of those 60 species that has caffeine in it. And it also has several other compounds, one in particular called theobromide. And theobromide gives us that chocolate flavor. So theobromide is one of these flavonoids. Everybody heard of these flavonoid compounds, right? So that's the chocolate flavonoid from theobromide from the tree Theobroma. Now the chocolate tree is in a family called the Malvaceae. It's one of these plant families. And we have a number of Malvaceae examples in Wisconsin. One of those is the basswood tree. Has anyone ever seen a basswood? If you're from Germany, they call them linden trees, right? There's the Avenue of the Lindens in Berlin. So the linden tree, it's related to the chocolate tree, and in fact, the theobromide compounds are in the flowers of a linden. So if you take the flowers of a basswood in spring here and pick them and wash them up, you can mash them into water and you'll get a slight chocolatey tasting drink, and it's coming from that similar compound. Yeah. And what was interesting, I learned that when I was a young Boy Scout, right? And we had this, edible plants guide thing. And I learned that, and at that time, chocolate and basswood trees were not in the same family. We didn't actually combine them in the same family until we had molecular DNA evidence more recently, within the past 10 or 20 years, and we realized that they were related to each other evolutionarily. But there should have been a hint there that the fact you could get a chocolate flavor off of a basswood and chocolate from chocolate trees, that there may have been a connection. So that's very interesting. The other thing in the Malvaceae is cotton, right? So cotton we're wearing is in that same family. I don't think our shirts taste like chocolate. I'm not going to try in front of everybody. A lot of tea drinkers in the audience. So tea is interesting. Here's the scientific name, Camellia sinensis. And this sinensis here, that means of China, right? Now, tea is native to India and Burma and has nothing really to do with China, except for the fact that by the time that Western scientists got around and were assigning scientific names, tea had already been moved to China for thousands of years. So when they encountered it, when the guys who gave this scientific name to tea encountered it, they encountered it in China. But it actually originated in sort of the Himalaya region in eastern India. Now, tea it's a tree, right? It's a low-growing shrub, and what we eat actually is the leaves that are picked off the tea plant and processed. Now, there's two compounds in addition to caffeine that are in the tea tree, and these two compounds, they're the theaflavins and the thearubigins. Say that 3 times fast. So theaflavins, they give you that bright taste that you get from tea. So when you sip it, you kind of have this, I don't know how to describe it other than this brightness to the tea. And you can visually see that, the theaflavins in the yellow color that comes out of the tea bag. The thearubigins, they give the tea the body. So if you have a really strong tea, like an English breakfast tea or something like that, it's really kind of feels like a fortified tea, it's got a lot of mouthfeel. That's coming from these thearubigins. And The interesting thing about these two molecules is their size is slightly different and their polarity is slightly different. So remember early on when I was talking about hydration and how water is a polar molecule, right? And it has this electromagnetic attraction. Well, the rate at which these two compounds leave the tea leaf is slightly different. So if you can experiment with this. Go home and get a clear mug or a clear cup or something and pour boiling water in there. And then get a tea bag, just regular black tea, and dip it in there. And watch very closely. You'll first see a yellow plume that'll come off the bag. And a split second later, you'll see that red plume coming out of there. And that's the differential rate at which these are leaving the tea bag. One more factoid here. We consume 3.5 million metric tons of tea a year. Yeah, worldwide. Now, tea, there's a lot of different things that are called tea, right? We got green tea, we got white tea, oolong tea, black tea. So their tea breaks down into two different groups. There's tea that are using this true tea plant that I was just talking about. And then there's tea that doesn't have that true tea plant in it. Those are most technically called herbal teas. So we'll talk about herbal teas, but first let's address all these different varieties of the true tea plant. So we've got the difference between green, white, oolong, and black tea is all in the processing, right? So all of these start off, we harvest the leaves off of the tea tree, and they're all subjected to withering. They're basically left in the sun, and they kind of dry out a little bit. They get, flopsy. And then you have to make some choices. So if you want to make black tea, the next thing you do is you put a big heavy roller over the leaves and kind of crush them. So smash them up. After you crush them, they go through this process called oxidation. Now, if any of those of you who are in the industry, the tea industry calls this fermentation. It's not actually a true fermentation step, it's oxidation. Oxidation is, it's the same process when you cut an apple and you leave it out, the apple starts to brown. That's oxidation, right? So that oxidation process. And it's a protection mechanism that the cells have. So if the tea leaves are damaged, say you ran a big crushing roller over them, a bunch of the guts inside the cell get released, and those guts can be really detrimental to the plant. So the plant's cells have special enzymes that will grab those harmful elements and chew them up. And that's what you see as the browning process. So we're just harvesting that natural process, using it to our own gain. There's a theme here. All right, so oxidation. If you're making oolong, you'll also do oxidation, but you'll skip the crushing step. If you're making black tea, you'll jump right to a drying step. So you let it oxidize, you dry it out, and then you're done with black tea. With oolong, after you've oxidized it, then you bake it in an oven, so get it hot, nice and dark and kind of charcoaly. Then you dry it out, and you're done with the step on the tea. These top two here, green and white tea, they're basically skipping the oxidation step. So they're more of a raw, think of green tea, it's a very grassy kind of flavor relative to black tea. So we skip over oxidation. We can either choose to steam it or bake it. So if we want white tea, we bake it. If we're going for green tea, we steam it. And then after that, the final drying process, and you get your last tea. Right? So those are the main differences in these types of teas that we have. It's all in the processing. The species is the same. Even special varieties like Darjeeling. Darjeeling tea, it's still the same species. It's just coming from one particular region in India. There's probably something in the soil in that region that is adding additional flavor compounds to the leaves. But as far as a species, it's the same species. Now, herbal teas, right? Some of you probably drink these herbal teas. Chamomile. This is a classic sleepy time, soothing tea. Chamomile actually comes from two different species. It's the European daisy species. Matricaria and Chamomilium, right? So chamomile, it can be a tea unto itself, an herbal tea unto itself, or it can be added to one of the true teas to kind of supplement it with different flavors. That's what it looks like, in case you're wondering. This is my favorite here, the Rooibos. Anybody ever had Rooibos tea? Yeah, I like this, especially if you haven't had it, you can go try it after the talk. I like it with vanilla. Rooibos is an African shrub. It's a kind of a low-growing, grows about that tall. It's in the pea family, so it's related to beans and peas. This is what it looks like. You can see here's that pea-like flower on there. And Rooibos, all they're doing, they're taking these leaves, these kind of needly shaped leaves, and stripping them off the plant and then drying them out to steep for tea. So Rooibos, it's usually a tea unto itself. There's no caffeine in it. That's the difference between these herbal teas and the tea teas, is we kind of skip the caffeine. And then jasmine, here, if you've never seen a jasmine, here's the flower off the jasmine tree and one of the leaves from jasmine. I don't really like green tea, but I like green tea with jasmine because the jasmine adds some flavor to it that kind of cuts the grassiness. But you can get jasmine tea on its own, just for that flavor. So one thing about jasmine, it's in the olive family. It's kind of crazy, right? We talked about families and how, the Theobroma was in the same family as basswood, and so you could kind of make this chocolate drink out of basswood. So if you're daring, go home and get some olives and try to make olive tea. I think it'd be kind of disgusting, but olive family. Wines. So people go nuts up over wine. People paint wine, right? Wine, the basic recipe on wine is fruit, water, and yeast. And one thing, I'm actually going to back up here a second. So I mentioned that caffeine was the unifying feature to all of our uppers, right? Well, the unifying feature to all of our downers is this other chemical called alcohol. Now, alcohol is actually a group of chemicals. There's a lot of different types of alcohols. They all end in an ol, an OL. So we have things like methanol and ethanol and propanol. The one that we drink is ethanol. It's also the one that our cars drink, right? I remember when we first started ethanolating gasoline, there was a Simpsons episode, and it showed Homer filling up his car and then taking a sip off the thing. So ethanol works for both cars and humans, but I don't recommend drinking your gasoline. Now, alcohol, the way that we produce alcohol for beverages is we use this microorganism called yeast. So there's a little drawing of a yeast microorganism. And yeast they're a type of fungi, right? They're a mushroom, basically a microorganism. Well, they're not a mushroom, but they're a fungi. So microorganism fungi, and what yeast do is yeast needs sugar. So if you put yeast into an environment with sugar, the yeast will consume the sugar, they'll burn it for their own energy, and then they'll produce alcohol as a waste product. Okay, so let that sink in a moment. All alcohol is yeast urine. Okay? So, yeast make alcohol, but it's their waste product. So yeast are just trying to, make a living in a sugary world. Okay, now we can get to the wines. So wine, we have fruit, water, yeast. So that's the yeast's role is to make the alcohol. Now the fruit's role is to provide the sugar, right? So in wine, the number one fruit in wine is grapes. And what's funny is I've caught myself saying, oh no, I want a fruit wine, like a plum wine. And then it occurs to me that, wait, grapes are fruit, so all wine has fruit. The main difference between your red wines and your white wines is whether the grapes were pressed with their skin in a red wine or without their skin in a white wine. So the difference there comes from a chemical compound called an anthocyanin. The anthocyanin is kind of a pink reddish colored compound, and it has absolutely no taste. So you're not really getting any taste difference, it's just a coloration difference there. Wines where the grapes would have a bloom on them, and that bloom would be the naturally occurring yeast. That's, in ancient times, that's how the wine was produced, is it would just naturally ferment. So the yeast would naturally make that waste product of alcohol. And grapes and wine are one of the oldest domesticated crops that we have. They were domesticated around 4000 BC, and they appear on grapes and wine appear in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics about 2000 BC. So that's a long time ago. The grape plant itself, it's Vitis vinifera. Here's the scientific name here. And this word vitis, this is a Latin word. It means life, right? So this Latin word, wine was so intimately associated with living and having, vitality that we get this word like life, vitality, vitis, all from the word grape, or the scientific name for grapes. Grapes, most varieties of grapes are this species, Vitis vinifera. The Concord grape, which I believe it was domesticated in North America. It's a different species here, Labrusca. And then there's another one, the Muscadine grape, which is Vitis rotundiflora, folia. So those are our grape species. And grapes were possibly originally domesticated in Armenia. There's some indication that that's the case, but we're not entirely sure because it was so ancient. So like I said, grapes were sort of the number one fruit that made wine. But wines can be made from other fruits. And if they're made from other fruits, we call them by different names. We don't really use the name wine, even though, process-wise, they are a wine. So if we use grape, we have wine. If we use an apple, we oftentimes call it a hard cider. And if we use a pear, we call it a perry. Right? Anyone ever had a perry? That's just a wine made from pears. Now, one interesting thing, I got this diagram here. This is an apple cut in half. So apples and pears are from the same scientific family, the rose family. And this is interesting with apples. This is a special type of fruit. It's called a pome, P-O-M-E. And pomes, the fruit part, this is where the stem of the apple would be. And this shape right here, it's got this line. It's labeled mesocarp. We oftentimes call that the core of the apple. Like when you're eating an apple, there's the apple core. This is the technical fruit of the plant. And the part of the apple that we eat, the flesh, that is actually a part of the flower. And so what happens in an apple is the flower will start to produce a fruit. But the flower part of the apple will begin to enlarge and get fleshy, and it will wrap around the fruit, and it'll finally fuse to the fruit so that we get this fleshy part of the apple, and then the core, and inside the core is where the seeds are. So, and both, this happens in both pears and apples. You get that core there. Now, I mentioned that yeast was the thing we used to make alcohol, right? So, the problem is that yeast, there's 3 different species of yeast that are most commonly used. There's basically ale yeast, lager yeast, and champagne yeast. Now, ale and lager yeast will produce an alcohol concentration of about 4 to 5%. And after 4 to 5%, the environment gets too toxic for them to survive, right? So yeast are sort of an allegory for humans. We can use up all of our resources and produce toxins, and then we eventually destroy our environment and we can't survive. Champagne yeast is the exception to that. They can get upwards of 18 to 20% alcohol content, right? The problem is, once you get to 18, 20%, those yeast die as well. So now we need a mechanical means to jack the alcohol percent up to 40% or 80%, depending on what you're drinking. And that physical process is distillation. So distillation is just you heat a liquid that contains water and alcohol, and they differentially separate, and then there's like this cloud of alcohol inside the distilling chamber. And if you run cold water through that cloud will condense like raindrops of pure alcohol, and it'll drip back down, and so you can separate the water from the alcohol and increase your alcohol content. So all of the liquors are different from beer and wine because they undergo this distillation process. Now the basic recipe here for liquors is you have a sugar source, you create your alcohol in distillation, and then you do some sort of processing and flavoring to that alcohol. And this slide's going to kind of blow your mind here. Lots of colors. What we've got this column. This shows a number of different liquors that you're hopefully used to. This gives you the sugar source that those liquors are drawing from. They're producing alcohol based on those sugar sources. Some idea of the processing that happens, and some idea of the flavoring. Okay? So I know this grid's a lot to take in, but the green right here under the sugar source, these are all grains. So they're all different types of grains, barley, maize, or corn, a blend of different grains. And these are your whiskeys. So we've got Scotch, bourbon, other types of random whiskeys like rye. And then there's a drink here. I don't actually know how to pronounce it. Baijiu, I believe. That's also a grain drink. Now look down here, this brown. We see the brown says sugar molasses. So molasses can serve as the sugar source for rum. And this was a classic trade. There would be molasses would be produced in the Caribbean, and then or molasses was produced in Boston, and then sent down to the Caribbean to produce rum. So that's why you get a lot of the Caribbean rums. And this is one of my favorites here, the agave. The agave plant produces sugar for a group of drinks called mezcal, one of which is tequila. And then if your sugar source is some kind of random fruit, we oftentimes call the alcohol brandy. All right, so the most common brandy is made from grapes. Brandy is basically a liquored wine. And these are your sugar sources. Processing is basically like filtration. So in vodka, you get a double filtration step to make it ultra pure. Sometimes you get fermentation and malting happening, or you get some kind of roasting step, smoking step. But the other part I want to point out is flavoring. So you see these red categories, they say wood barrels. Wood barrels are an important flavoring element to a lot of drinks. And so I kind of want to just walk into that a little bit. So let's talk about these wood barrels. So what you're seeing on the screen is a microscopic view of a cross-section of a piece of wood. And this wood is coming from different oak trees. So most often, barrel aging or barrel flavoring is done in oak barrels. Now, what I want to point out is there are hundreds of species of oaks worldwide, but they fall into two general groups, the red oak and the white oak group. Now take a look. See all these little holes in the oak wood? Why in the world would you make a barrel with all of these little holes in it? Right? I mean, the barrel would leak like a sieve. And in fact, if you make your barrel from a red oak type species, it does indeed leak. You cannot make a watertight barrel from a red oak. If you look at the white oak here, it also has these holes, but down below you can see there's kind of like a whitish webby stuff in there. That whitish webby stuff is called a tylosis, and the tylosis seals up the holes in the white oak group. I'll back up here and mention these holes, the purpose of the holes are the tree will conduct water from its roots up to its leaves through these holes. So the holes are part of what make the rings when you cut a tree and you see the rings. What you're seeing is the density of holes that are in the tree stem. So all of our oak barrels are made from species in the white oak group because the white oaks seal up their holes after they're done with them. Okay? So if someone comes along and tries to sell you red oak barrels, don't buy them. Now the reason we use oak is not necessarily for the holes. In fact, that's a drawback. We use it for the chemical compounds that are in the wood. So here are a couple of chemical compounds. One of them is vanillin. Also occurs in a plant called vanilla. Provides a vanilla flavor. There's another one, furfural. I love that. Furfural has a sweet and toasty flavor. So when you put the alcohol into a barrel that's made out of this wood, the wood and the alcohol actually interact and they exchange some of these compounds. And so that's what barrel aging does, is it imbues the alcohol with these compounds that are naturally occurring in the oak's wood. And you can only use a barrel so many times before it's exhausted of these compounds. And what's nice is when you're done with the barrel, a lot of these local craft breweries have now been putting their beer in the old whiskey barrels so that they can get a little bit of that flavoring into the beer. So it's a nice way of recycling the barrels. Yeah, so okay, lactones, a woody flavor, terpenes give you a tea tobacco flavor, and tannins give you a mouthfeel, that is stringency. The key thing about all of the uppers, what unites them, is this molecule right here. It's called caffeine. I had way too much of it this morning, so I'm a little jittery. And caffeine's really interesting. So it's known from 60 different species of plants. And one thing about caffeine, or the reason that plants make caffeine, is as a defense molecule. All right, so the defense against what? Well, it's defense against predators, or specifically herbivores. So if you're a little caterpillar and you want to chew on one of these 60 plants that produces caffeine, you're going to be eating the leaves and you're going to be absorbing caffeine. And now we all know that caffeine makes humans jittery. So if you can imagine a little caterpillar absorbing a lot of, heavy load of caffeine in its system, it's going to start twitching. And likely it's going to twitch itself right off the leaf. And so that's the defensive mechanism that the plant is producing or caffeine is producing for the plant. So it's not making it for our benefit. The plant is making it for its own selfish benefit. Now, I have this note here. It says it's a double-edged sword for invertebrates. So what I mean by that is there's also a study that looks at caffeine in the nectar of flowers. And when caffeine shows up in the nectar of flowers, bees that visit these flowers, they get a caffeine load into their bodies as well. But in the bees, the caffeine actually enhances their memory for where the plant was. So it's called reward memory. So bees, if you don't know, the bees they'll fly to a plant and they find it flowering, it's got a good nectar reward. They'll fly back to their hive and they'll do a little dance and tell their friends where the plant is. And by having caffeine in the nectar, that dance and relocation ability of bees is enhanced. So what does that mean for the plant? It means the plant gets more bees visiting it, means it gets more pollen, which means it produces more seed, which means it produces more baby plants. Right? So it's a benefit to the plant both ways. It repels caterpillars, and it also attracts honeybees and increases its seed set. So that's the origin of caffeine for the plant side of things. Now, on the human side of things, we know that caffeine is a mild stimulant of the human immune system. And what's interesting about the molecule, over here, you can take a look. This is what the molecule caffeine looks like. And this structure is what's known as a purine. So a purine is a special type. It's a group of molecules. And all of us have purines in our bodies right now. They're a part of our DNA. So remember, DNA, it's sort of like a ladder shape, and it's got two strands that come down, and there's rungs on the ladder. So one of those rungs is a purine, and one is a pyrimidine. And caffeine is a purine. Now, a study in 2013 showed that using a computer model of a DNA molecule, they could artificially substitute the caffeine molecule onto our DNA. Right? This is kind of mind-blowing. Can you imagine being a caffeine mutant? Right? So somebody, I mean, if there's anybody from Marvel or DC in the audience, please make a movie about the caffeine mutant, because that would be awesome. Right, so this is all theoretical, right? They didn't actually do this. It was a computer modeling exercise. But here was their conclusion. The caffeine molecule can be incorporated into the DNA macromolecule, so that means they can put it onto a piece of DNA, and pair it with T or C. So this is one of these pyrimidines that it pairs with. In normal and rare state, respectively. So normally it pairs with T. So the caffeine molecule may be considered as a weak mutagenic compound. Right? It's kind of not so great for those who are drinking coffee right now in the audience. So caffeine could be a weak mutagen, just a theoretical study though, not demonstrated. Here's another thing that was demonstrated about caffeine. So has anybody ever seen this study or heard of this study? Yeah, okay. So there's one or two, three people in the audience. So this was interesting. It was done in 1995 by a group out of NASA, I believe. I don't know exactly why they were doing this, but what they did is they took a spider, and they had a spider weave a normal web. right? So this is just spiders weaving a web. And then what they did is they fed the spider caffeine. So over here, you feed the spider caffeine, and it kind of goes, oh, gotta make a web, blah, right? And so it made this thing. And what the lesson to be learned here is that caffeine helps it go faster, not better, right? But it doesn't stop there. So not only did they give the spiders caffeine, they also gave them marijuana, right? So this is what THC does to the spider. Now compare these two, right? This is caffeine, this is marijuana. So here, they were kind of lazy, kind of mellow, but they still had the munchies, so they needed to make their web to get flies. And over here, it's just like, nope, gotta work, caffeine. I like this, and it's, I kind of make it a cutesy thing. We give spiders caffeine, and they make a crazy web. But the reality of this study, or that the objective take-home message is, caffeine is a neurotoxin. And that's demonstrated by the spiders here, who have a much smaller nervous system, but they're being affected enormously by the caffeine.